Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Agile Mind. So today we're going to be talking about the Scrum team, right? I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of have a breakdown of the structure of a Scrum team. And we're going to talk about the different roles within the Scrum team, right? Such as the Scrum Master, the product owner, and as well as the development team, right? Get a little breakdown on how their role also play out in different Scrum events, right? So hopefully you guys stay tuned, and hopefully this session will be educative and informative for you all. Okay, so when we talk about the Scrum team, right, it typically consists of three main roles. What are those three roles? We're talking about the Scrum Master, and then we have the product owner, and then of course your dev team. I also want to kind of break it down to the dev team, right? Because sometimes when we talk about dev team, we think about programmers, right? But it's also important to understand that the dev team does not necessarily just include coders, right? You may have your testers, your software testers, or your QA testers, or your quality assurance, or just testers, right? Depending on the type of organization you're working at and what they identify themselves, right? So it's important to understand that you do have your developers or the coders, and then you also have your testers. And those two come together to make the dev team, right? Or the developers. I think even in the new Scrum, this new Scrum guide, right? It calls everyone as, is it developer or development team?
A development team.
Development, it still calls that. I thought that was the old Scrum guide.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I think it's still development team. I'm not sure if it changed
It
to the developers. I could try to look that up.
Yeah, I thought they actually
Because
changed.
I think it changed in the Scrum guide 2021. Hold on.
Yeah, it was during COVID.
Yes. Yeah, okay. It's developed. For 2022, it's developers, it's no longer development team. So
Okay,
you're
cool.
correct.
Okay. So those make the developers, right? And also when it comes to the coders themselves, right? It's also important to know that there are different skill sets when it comes to coders, right? For example, you might have Appian developer, you might have ETL developer, you might have SQL developer, you might have software engineers, you might have Drupal developer, right? Is so many of them, Java developer, I can go on, right? So it's important to also understand that within those coders, and I'm specifically using the word coder and not developer, right? Because that consists of the development team or the developers. So I'm being very specific when I mean coders, right? So
Yes.
within those coders, I'm sorry, Kirk, you wanted to say
No, I was
something?
just saying yes. And I just maybe just kind of give a example. I mean, what does ETL mean, which is this extract, transform, and load. So that's what that acronym stands for as one of the type of developers. But yeah, continue.
Thank you for that. Do you want to also explain Appian developer? What SQL developer? Maybe that would be a different session where we can
Yes.
do
Yeah.
a little breakdown of those type of coders, right? And I think that's actually a good idea. We should definitely do a video of that.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So it's important to also understand that, right? And oftentimes too, we tend to see BAs in the team itself, but it's also important to know that the BA are more on the business side, right? And not necessarily the development team, because oftentimes I know I've worked in a couple organizations where they would ask, does the BA also story points or do they estimate, right? So it's important to understand that they're more on the business side, right? So they're supporting the product owner and not necessarily the development team. But also some BAs too do testing, right? Maybe UAT testing or performance testing or some sort of that, right? They may contribute to the development team, but it's important to understand that when it comes to estimation, only the development team has authority to do so. Okay, so do you think we can proceed? We have a great understanding when it comes to like the Scrum team and the structure.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah.
We could definitely
All right.
proceed. Yep.
Okay, so now let's move on to the product owner. What does the product owner consist of, right? So it's important to understand the product owner role itself. So when it comes to the product owner, right, their main role is to really, I think even in the PSM exam, right, it mentioned that their role is to optimize the value of the development team, right? So essentially, their role is to ensure that those business values come to life, right? How does that come to life? In the sense of is visible and transparent in the backlog, right? The priority of the backlog. So that way, the development team can really ensure that they are focused in delivering those value at the end of each iteration or at the end of the sprints, right? So let's do a little breakdown of some of these roles and responsibilities of the PO. As we can see, it says that the product owner is responsible to develop those requirements in the backlog. They're also responsible in gathering requirements from business owners, and sometimes business owners can be identified as stakeholders or sponsors, right? So different terminology for different organizations that you may work for, right? And it says that the product owner typically will break down large requirements into user. Now I'm going into user story. They will break down those large requirements or epics, right, into smaller stories or into user stories, right? And then even sometimes, depending on their knowledge when it comes to supporting the team in understanding those requirements and understanding how to break it down, they can also be able to help the team when it comes to giving further clarity and guidance, right, when it comes to development work. However, that does not mean they should tell the development team how to do the work, right? There's a difference between giving guidance or giving some kind of advice, especially if they do have that development background, but does not certainly mean that they should tell them how to do their work. All right. So there are different tools when it comes to the product owner using in populating those requirements, right? So that way it will be visible for the team or the project team or the product team. Oftentimes we have Jira, right? We have Riley, we have Trello, we have version 1, we have Azure DevOps. I believe those are the ones that I know so far or that I've at least used. Am I missing any, Mr.
No,
Carter?
those are the basic ones that I'm aware of.
Okay. So going down to some of the responsibilities of the product owner, right? One, we already talked about their role is to really prioritize those user stories in the backlog, right? And I'm sure that a product owner, they're well trained, so they have specific techniques when it comes to prioritizing those user stories in the backlog. I know one of the technique is the Moscow technique or value cost metrics, Kano technique. Is so many of them that they can definitely use when it comes to prioritizing those stories in the backlog. Another responsibility that they have is to make sure that the development team understands the requirements and expectation of each user story, especially in priority order, right? So they are there to guide the team in understanding those requirements. It's their job to ensure that the development team understand those requirements, because through understanding, they're able to really build quality code, right? And build business value or deliver value at the end of the sprint. They're also responsible in participating on major Scrum ceremonies, right? And we're going to dive into some of those ceremonies and what it would look like for each roles, right, within those ceremonies. Am I missing anything, Mr. Clark? Do you want to add?
No.
This
Yeah, I
is
just
your
want.
domain.
Oh yeah, this is definitely my domain. So I just want to add a few things. So you said it all right. You're correct. I just wanted to add a few things. For number one, just to let everyone know that you as a product owner, you're not alone when it comes to prioritizing the backlog. You can you also can receive help from the Scrum Master, the developers, because they can assist you with prioritizing a backlog by sharing information about estimates, any dependencies, any technical work items, et cetera. And you as a product owner, you have to ensure that the team have a shared understanding of the project vision, the project goals, and the details of the work to be done. So, you're definitely not by yourself. You're still working with your team to make sure that you're maximizing value. And
Exactly.
that,
You made
yeah.
a great point. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it, you know. And then you as a product owner, you also have to you know, ensure that you have a deep understanding of you know, a knowledge of what needs to be built, and this way you'll be able to better communicate that with your stakeholders.
Exactly. Good point. Good point. Um, in hindsight, right, additional responsibilities of the product owner. Definitely, they have the authority to accept and reject stories. Mr. Kirk, do you want to talk a little bit about that as far as in accepting and rejecting a user story? When does that happen, or why would they need to reject user stories?
You know, sometimes the need of the stakeholder might change. So there may be a time where you may have like a user story, and then you can just you know, based on what the end user is looking for, the stakeholder is looking for, you could just you're the one that make the decision to just remove that particular or reject that particular user story. So the only time I know that I've rejected this user story is when the priority of the stakeholder has changed, and then they realize, okay, we don't there's necessarily need that user story. So that's when we go ahead and remove it.
Good point. And even from my experience too, especially as a when I was a Scrum Master, is also looking at those acceptance criteria, right?
Yes.
Ensuring that those acceptance criteria does meet the testing criteria, right? And also meets the definition of done, right? So
Yes.
whatever we have as definition of done and whatever those acceptance criteria are, when we look at those acceptance criteria and also see that the story meets our definition of done, then of course the product owner can accept that story. But if it doesn't, I always encourage to, you know, I, I don't know if I should use the word reject, but maybe pause and not mark it as done, right? Because it doesn't seem like it's actually completed based on either lack of something in the acceptance criteria or part of our definition of done.
Yes. And then you had to ask, you know, when does that normally happen? It can happen anytime, you know, during yeah, I mean, I had to you know, well, you didn't want to use reject, but we did
Yeah.
remove, yeah. You know, there was one time that we did remove a user story based on you know, feedback from the stakeholder. So it could happen anytime.
Okay. Even so, what about during daily stand up, uh, during um well, I guess during daily stand up throughout that whole 2 weeks, do you think that can also happen?
No, never, yeah, never, we never rejected a user story during the daily stand-up. No.
Okay, I asked that just to be very specific, right? Because I
Gotcha.
know when we say at any time, someone can say, "Well, do we do that to
Yes, yes,
day
not,
one
yeah.
or day two, day three of daily stand up?" So it's important to be mindful of that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
you're right.
technically, um, at probably towards the end of the sprint, right? Probably in your sprint review or demo, and you guys see that okay, this story is not does not meet what the acceptance criteria has listed or does not
Yes,
meet our definition of done, then of course we cannot mark that story as done because it
exactly.
does not meet those criteria.
Yes. Yeah. So it's usually during a sprint review, but definitely not during the daily stand-up call.
All right. So then this question says, and this is actually in the PSM exam. Can the product owner or when can the product owner terminate a sprint?
Was this okay? Was this one of
That
the
happened to you?
um yeah, I don't think I have never terminated a sprint at all. I've never been in that situation where I had to terminate a sprint.
Okay. I know that when I worked at a banking company, there was a time that we actually ended the sprint and terminated it. And the only reason for that was because we decided to take a pivot on the project, right? So we were doing something and we stakeholders decided that, you know, put a put a dead end to that project because it's taking longer than we expected and we don't have the necessary resources to be able to do this. And we also have another team that is actually working on almost exactly or similar functionality that we were trying to build. So they were like, just end this, and then we'll just allow them or integrate it to the other team to be able to complete the project, right? So that was the reason why we terminated the sprints, right? And as actually terminated that project, because then it was taking a pivot into another team or into another project.
Okay. So so basically, did it become this obsolete? So then that's when you,
Exactly.
okay, yeah, all right, because
Yeah.
that's when you can decide to cancel. But I've never been in that situation. And then I'm pretty sure that in order to do that, you got to have some type, maybe you get influenced by the developers as well as the stakeholders and the Scrum Master as well. So it's not a decision that you probably take on your own as a product owner.
That's true. Because it's more of a teamwork, team collaboration.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So we go into a little bit more on product ownership, right? It says the authority of prioritization, accepting, rejecting story completion, terminating sprints are solely upon the PO, right? But of course, as Mr. Kirk just said, right, you definitely need the input of your team itself and definitely the stakeholders to be able to ultimately make that decision. And then it says at the same time, the product owner is the core member of the Scrum team. What does that mean? Mr. Kirk, what does that mean as a product owner? You're the core of the Scrum team. Why?
Well, basically, you're the one that's you're bringing the work to the team. So that's the reason why you're a core member. You're bringing them your team the work. You're bringing them what needs to be built. So that's why the PO is basically one of the core members of that Scrum team.
Okay, but have you ever felt, or have you ever been in a situation where you either working with other Scrum Master who feel like they are the manager of that team? Everything goes through them, and everything is it's either they say yes or no.
No, I pretty much have a good relationship with other Scrum Masters. I've never really run into a Scrum Master that felt like they were the all in all for the team. Never really, I've never had that experience. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen,
For
but I've
you,
never had that experience so far.
good for you, because there are product owners out there who essentially sometimes they become the managers, right? Or they take on the
Yeah.
role as a project manager, or as the sponsor of the project, right? And oftentimes that authority can tend to rub off the wrong way, or misuse of authority,
Yes.
or title, right?
Yes.
That can tend to rub off the wrong way and lean towards being managerial. And sometimes too, if they do have that development background or that technical background, they can kind of tend to use that to deprive developers from being innovative, right? From thinking outside the box, having that discovery process and bringing in ideas and being innovative, simply because the product owner wants to push his thoughts and his ways to how that development work should be, right? So oftentimes that comes up, and it's important for product owners, whomever you are, to acknowledge that it's truly a teamwork, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
allow feedback from the team, allow that innovative ideas and concepts to come from the team, so that way you can build better quality and better products.
Yeah, you see, when I hear that, then that to me it just sounds like the recipe for not being successful. When you begin to take that role, you don't allow your team to to self-manage themselves. So when you come in as a manager or a dictator, it doesn't sound like a recipe that'll be successful for your team.
Agree. Alrighty, now let's dive into the Scrum advance. So when it comes to backlog refinement meeting, right? I typically think that's kind of the first meeting that set the tone for that team or for that product that we're trying to develop, right? I feel like
Yes.
every team definitely needs refinement meeting before we can even go into sprint planning. So when it
Yes.
when it comes to refinement meeting, you'd be surprised. Some people just go straight to sprint planning
Oh
without
no.
refinement. Like,
Oh
what are you doing?
yeah.
Um, So when it comes to refinement meeting, the product owner role, right? Part of it is creating those user story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ensuring that those user story meet their definition of ready, right? And there are
Correct.
different criteria for definition of ready and definition of done. That's definitely something we can discuss maybe later on the next videos, right? So they
Yes.
have to ensure that they create those stories in the backlog. They also have to ensure, and this is prior, right, to backlog refinement meeting, because oftentimes people start creating stories in the backlog or start prioritizing stories in the backlog, right? And it shouldn't necessarily be the case, because the backlog refinement meeting is essentially to look at what is already there, right? Of course, there may be some adjustments, there may be some clarity that is needed, or there may be some additional stories that may need to be broken down, right? That's fine. But the concept or conceptualization of a story should not be happening in the backlog refinement meeting, right? So prior to that, the product owner definitely should be creating those user stories in the backlog, ensure that they are prioritized and that they're ready to actually be looked at during backlog refinement meeting, right? And then during backlog refinement meeting, they now want to explain each of those user story to the development team, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
to the Scrum team, explain that, answer questions that may come across, right? So that way we can get that clarity and be able to proceed to the next story. So going through them one at a time based on their priority, right? Getting
Yes.
any questions, answering any questions, and maybe from those questions, we might have new user story or concept that he may have missed that now we can create in the backlog, right? And even sometimes estimating of those user story can also occur during the backlog refinement meeting, right? So estimating that story, and then if that story maybe has a big points in it, then we can go ahead and break it down, right? Identifying some of those dependencies, some of those risks, some of those complexity within the story. So that way we truly know that we have a good understanding of that user story and can break it down better, right? And then, of course, after backlog refinement meeting, whatever feedback that was received from the development team during the backlog refinement meeting, right? Of course, you want to put that feedback into the backlog. You may need to reprioritize the backlog. You may need to create more user stories in the backlog, right? Or
Exactly.
refine certain acceptance criteria or descriptions of the user stories after the refinement meeting. Am I missing anything, Mr. Product Owner?
No, no, you're not missing anything. You've got it all right.
Okay. All righty. So now during the daily stand-up, right? Which daily stand-up typically happen when you start your sprints, right? And typically you do sprint planning before you go into your daily stand-up. So when it comes to the daily stand-up, the product owner doesn't is not necessarily the one facilitating that meeting, right? However, they're there to engage and participate. How do they participate? Not by causing disruption, right, or interrupting the team, because the daily stand up is essentially for the development team to have a conversation within themselves, right, and see if there are any blockers or any thing that they need to solution or resolve. Not solution during the daily stand up, but on a high level discussion, and then take it to a different call. So when it comes to backlog refinement meeting, the product owner is there to listen, more listening, right? And then if there's any question that needs answer or any clarity on those user story that needs clarity on, he can provide those feedback, right? And that's where his participation comes in place. Or if there's any reprioritization that needs to happen, right? Or maybe something came in that the business asked for. Now he needs to bring that up to the team, and then we can talk about how we can plan accordingly to be able to meet those business needs, right? So those are things that may happen during daily stand up. Mr. Kirk, what have you noticed?
Okay. So for me, my team, they're in another country,
Mm-hmm.
international. So there's a huge gap in time. So when there's a daily stand-up being conducted, I'm not so much involved. But what my Scrum Master will do is just she'll send sort of like just like a snippet, just like a brief some minutes of what was discussed, and that's basically it. And if there's anything that they need to follow up on with me, then I also take a look, and I'll may add one item or two. But I don't. This is strictly for the developers. I don't really get involved, but by my Scrum Master sending me just like a snippet of what's going on, I have a good idea of what was discussed.
Awesome, awesome. And then we move into the sprint planning. So when it comes to the product owner during a sprint planning, right, they're once again there to ensure that the priority is being followed, right? Because we've already prioritized the backlog based on the business wants. So they need to ensure that the priority are being followed. Well, of course, with the assistance of the Scrum Master, right? So hopefully before sprint planning, they should at least be discussing what are the, on a high level, right, the product goal for that particular sprint, right? And then with the team, they're going to come up with a sprint goal. And of course, they need to ensure that the prioritization of those stories is already there in the backlog, right? So then we can pick up for sprint during sprint planning. So ensuring that the backlog is already prioritized, making sure the stories are all groomed and in ready states, right? And then of course, during the sprint planning, if they need to support the team in creating a sprint goal, then of course they can be able to do that with the product vision or the product goal, right? And then if there's any clarity, right, that is further needed during sprint planning, they're there to provide that clarity. And typically during sprint planning, it's kind of during a fast version of backlog refinement meeting of what I called it, right? So we go through the stories once again on a high level based on our capacity and velocity, right? We go through those stories, and then if those stories need further clarity, the product owner is there to provide further clarity, right? And ensure that the team are confident enough to be able to commit to those stories during sprint planning. And then, of course, after sprint planning, they want to ensure that they verify whatever the goal, meaning whatever the commitment is, right, during that sprint. They also want to verify that it does meet the priority or wants of the business, and probably communicate those goals with the stakeholder if need be. Any other input, Mr. Kirk?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I know we're still used to the old Scrum guide, so we tend to get used to the old terminology. That I just wanted to point out to the listeners that when he's saying groom, groom has been replaced by refine. So just keep that in mind. If you hear us slip and say groom, we really mean refine. But bear with us because it's really we're so used to the terminology that we forget that they changed that that term. Yes.
Good point. Good point. All righty. During sprint review. So before sprint review, typically I would say the product owner should definitely look at the column, right? I know some teams that will have a column that says ready for demo or ready for review or PO acceptance, right? Those are different columns that multiple teams would have before it gets to the column that says done. So oftentimes the product owner will go through those columns to make sure that once again, each of those stories within those columns, right, meet the definition of done and also has everything that the acceptance criteria has listed. And oftentimes they will also do UAT testing, right, just to see that the functionality are what the asks are, right? Are. So they have to ensure that it does meet the stakeholder asks, right? So oftentimes this is things that they would do, right? Identify stories that are ready for demo, send the detail or scope of demo probably to business, so that way we know what we need to demo. And oftentimes too, even before, this is where the new Scrum guide versus the old Scrum guide, right? Or some teams say review, some teams say demo. Just know we're talking about the same thing. So definitely the product owner needs to understand what the demonstration would be, so that way it's well communicated to the stakeholders, because oftentimes stakeholders would join those review meetings, right? And then during sprint review, definitely introducing the team, but oftentimes the Scrum Master are the one introducing the team and introducing what will be demo to the stakeholders back, right? And then if they're there to support in discussing what actually would be getting demoed, on that day, they would also support in doing that, right? Identifying what functionalities will be demoed and explain those functionalities that will be demoed, right? And then, of course, the development team will then proceed in demonstrating those functionality. And then, of course, during sprint review, product owners and scrum masters should definitely be taking notes as far as in those feedbacks, right? Whatever feedbacks that the stakeholder is given or whatever is not met, they need to take that feedback, and those feedback after the sprint review are what they're going to use to reprioritize the backlog, and also if new stories need to be created or if stories needs to be removed from the backlog, right? So those feedback are what they're going to use, and those feedback too would gear us to what we need to now do for the next sprint. Alrighty,
Wow.
now I'm sorry, you wanted to add something?
No, I'm just saying, wow. It's well said.
Now for the retrospective meeting. Oftentimes I think some Scrum team, right, feel like the product owner should not be there, right, because of that intimidation or not team not having that secure or safe place to really speak up. But it's actually helpful and productive for the product owner to be there in the retrospective meeting, right? Because remember, they are part of the Scrum team. So they need to understand, even from their side, what am I doing that I can improve on, right? And not necessarily just the development team. So prior to retrospective meeting, definitely they need to add their feedback, right? As far as in what went well, what didn't go well, and what needs improvement, right? They need to also add their suggestions, their feedbacks and inputs. And then, of course, during the retrospective meeting, they'll be there to discuss those feedbacks, right? And also listen to other feedbacks that the team is bringing onto, right? And if there's any improvement that they need to start doing, they can also take on some action items on what they can do to help facilitate the team to be successful or productivity, right? And some of those feedback can be, we need better requirements, right? We need
Yes.
clearer requirements. These requirements that we do have does not have all of the acceptance criteria in them, right? Or the stories that we do have does not have invest criteria in them, or they're not well prioritized, or they still have dependencies, or they're not broken down enough, right? So these are things that the product owner might get. Even talking about scope creep, we don't like scope creep, right? We don't like priorities getting put in during the sprints, right? It causes us to burn out. We're overcommitting, right? You need to help us push back a little bit. Too much work in the sprints, right? So these are some feedback that the product owner might get. And this can be helpful in how he then works with the stakeholder to ensure that the team are working effectively, right? And then, of course, after retrospective meeting, he needs to take on those action items or those feedback and either meet with the stakeholder to discuss how best to do those requirements, or work by himself and also work with the scrum master or the team to understand how he can then execute those action items that has been identified for the product owner. All right. Any feedback before we move on?
No, this is good. And like you said, product is it's really important that a product owner is involved with the retrospective. It's not just, for the developers alone, but for the entire team. So you covered that.
Okay. Now we're going to move on to the Scrum Master. So speaking of a Scrum Master, I started as a Scrum Master, so this is my heart and joy. So as a Scrum Master, who are you? Who are we? So it says the Scrum Master are servant leaders, or rather, leaders who serve, based on the new Scrum Guide. Why? They all mean the same thing. So they help to keep the team accountable to the commitment to the business, and also support in removing any roadblocks or blockers or impediments that the team may face or that may impair the team's productivity. They also meet with the team on a regular basis to review work and deliverables, and often in a weekly cadence. The Scrum Master is a coach, someone who motivates the team, someone who empowers the team, someone who helps the team to be successful, right? You're not there to enforce rules and policies. However, you're there to empower them to either adhere to some of those rules, processes, and whatever the case that is needed to be able to help the team become more successful, right? The goal of the Scrum Master is to help that Scrum or Kanban or SAFe or whatever framework they're using or whatever processes they're using, right? Helping them align to it as much as possible, right? Everything does not have to be teardrop, but if they're able to align to it, that would be awesome. And part of some of the roles of a Scrum Master is, of course, facilitate some of those Scrum events like your daily stand up, your retrospective meeting, your sprint planning, right? And oftentimes even your review, right? Especially if you know what the product is, there's no harm in supporting the team in facilitating that meeting. Also leading the team, right? And leading the project to success. There's a difference between leading and managing, right? So oftentimes we hear managing, we hear leading, but it's important to know as a servant leader, you're there to lead and you're there to serve, right? Without being afraid to be assertive, because it's important to know when to be assertive. You're there to also help um, set up and organize meetings that are critical to the success of the product, right? You're there to also coach the team on agile processes, agile principles and values, and as well as the organization. Oftentimes, organization or the team may be going through some kind of agile transformation. You're also there to help them through that transformation process. And of course, there's so much more that a Scrum Master can do depending on the environment or the domain that you're working with, right? Even you can also support in breaking user stories, creating user stories, right? If you do understand the product and you can support the product owner in such manner. So when it comes to Scrum, some of the Scrum Master role, as we're talking about, right? Part of it is establishing the Scrum framework, right? Supporting and establishing that. Being able to enable transparency within the team, right? Inspection and adaptation. That's part of those three Scrum pillars. So as a Scrum Master, it's our job to be able to enable and empower that with the Scrum team. Also support in resolving impediments. Are there any impediments or blockers that the team may be facing? Your role as a Scrum Master is to help facilitate that process, coach them on how to remove it themselves as they grow or as they mature as a team, right? Establishing an environment of agile development or establishing a safe environment where developers can develop, right? In agile, they said we all work in agile, right? Agile is flexible, so it's important to understand that as well, and not be rigid to those processes. Protecting the team from outside interruption, such as the stakeholders, right? Not allowing stakeholders to pick on developers or to request certain things from stakeholders, right? Being able to help them understand the priority order, right? And how agile works, right? So representing the team holistically and also helping them in a holistic manner, right? Meaning providing psychological safety, empowering them, right? Allowing them to be innovative and not necessarily rigid. All right, so what about Scrum Master in different, what Scrum Master should not do? I actually like this part. It says Scrum Master is not a manager. Scrum Master does not have the authority to hire or fire. I was actually doing an interview, so Scrum Master cannot take a decision of skill allocation task. That's more of a project management. Oftentimes, you can see organization that actually give that role to Scrum Master, right? Scrum Master actually taking on the hybrid role of a project manager and Scrum Master in today's society. So that is dependent on the environment that you're with. Scrum Master don't participate in estimation, right? But of course, they facilitate the process of estimation. So it's important to understand that we're not giving estimation. However, we are facilitating that process. All righty. So it moves on to talk about backlog refinement meeting, right? Scrum Masters are there to support the product owner when it comes to providing further clarity of that product vision, right? If they understand the product. They're also there to encourage the team to speak up. Are there any dependencies? Are there any risks? Please point it out, right? So you're there to really um, guide the team to speak up, right? And call out things when needed. All right. So before refinement meeting, of course, you're the one scheduling that meeting, right? So you want to have that meeting set so that way everyone that needs to be in that meeting is there. When it comes to the backlog refinement meeting, when we say facilitating the refinement meeting, right, it does not necessarily mean that you're the one leading that conversation, right? Essentially, it might just be setting the tone for that meeting, right? Welcoming everyone, having a prep talk with everyone, and then setting the foundation of that meeting. And of course, the product owner takes over. And then, of course, when it comes to having making sure that your summation tools are ready, if you're using story point, planning, poker, whatever the case may be, having those tools set up and sent to everyone for everyone to have access to them, right? And then, of course, after refinement meeting, you want to definitely circle back with your product owner to ensure that you all of the needs or wants during that discussion during the refinement meeting are captured, right? Are there things that is missing that you may support him in doing, right? So all of that you need to be able to do. Also, are there some dependencies or risk that they called out during refinement meetings? So you definitely want to pay attention so that way you can talk about those dependencies or schedule or coordinate meetings or events that is needed to be able to resolve those dependencies before hopefully you go into your sprint planning, right? During daily stand up, you're there as a scrum master. I would think even before daily stand up, going through your agile metrics, such as your burn down chart, your burn up chart, just to get an idea of how the sprint is going. Also, looking at your sprint health, right? They're there to help guide you or guide the team in being successful or successfully delivering in increments. So, going through some of those agile metrics, right? Of course, looking at your emails, looking at your columns or your Jira board or your active sprints to see, are there any blockers that have showed up? Are there any flag items, right? Are there any risk that has come up? So that way you can use those information to facilitate your daily stand up effectively. And then, of course, doing your daily stand up, this is where you want to start having conversation with the development team, or at least facilitate the process of them having a conversation within themselves, right? When it comes to talking about what their current progress is, right? How well are they doing? How are we executing the work that we planned for the sprints, right? Are there any blockers that we have found or any dependency that has been called out, right? And if so, are there any action items that we can now take on to be able to resolve those impediments, blockers, or dependencies during that sprint, right? So that way we are not impeded in delivering our commitment at the end of that sprint. So those are certain conversations that could occur during your daily stand up. And then, of course, after the daily stand up, that's where your execution as a Scrum Master comes in place. Is there any call out when it comes to dependencies or risk? Do I need to update stakeholders in regards to risk? Or do I need to populate that in somewhere in our documentation or Confluence to talk about those risks, right? Do I need to align with another Scrum Master? Do I need to set up an SOS, right? Do I need to set up a KT session? Those things you will now start executing based on the feedback that you've gotten from the daily stand-up, right? So that way you're helping your team to move along, right? So those are the things that would happen or part of your responsibility as a Scrum Master during these events. Am I missing anything, Mr. Kirk? After you?
Yes, I just have one quick question. I know you said that Scrum Master is not involved with hiring and firing, but you as a Scrum Master, have you ever been involved with interviewing, assisting with interviewing for another Scrum Master? Okay.
Yeah. I've been in. That's why I was saying that they said that you're not responsible for hiring and firing, but organization work differently, right? I've worked
Hmm.
in an organization where I was part of the hiring process, right? So it depends,
Okay. All right. Makes sense.
but not
Thanks.
necessarily firing.
Yeah, gotcha. Just the hiring portion.
Yeah. All right, of course, capacity planning. This definitely needs to happen prior to your sprint planning, right? So you definitely need to understand who are going to be available to be able to do the work, right? So understand your velocity for prior sprints. Typically 3 sprints down the line, you average it out, and then you understand part of your capacity is who is available to do the work, right? Compare your capacity to your velocity to be able to understand your commitment for the next sprints. And then, of course, with that information is what you bring into your sprint sprint planning, right? So before sprint planning, as a Scrum Master, you definitely want to have your capacity ready to go. Also, you want to discuss with the product owner prior to understand those stories that are prioritized and ready for the sprints, right? So there are no ambiguity or confusion when it comes to the sprint planning. It also helps the sprint planning to go a little bit more efficiently and faster, right? So having all of that set will be helpful. And then, of course, during your sprint planning, you want to go ahead and talk. I typically like to talk about the capacity and velocity of for the next or the upcoming sprints, right? Identify that, and then oftentimes some Scrum Masters also like to have a visual of what they did in the prior sprints, right? As far as in that burn down chart, what is that showing? What is that saying? Did we have a lot of scope creep? Do we have a lot of risks that came up? Do we have a lot of dependencies or blockers that came up, right? So sometimes those conversations can be brought up, or even inputs from your retrospective meeting can be brought up in sprint planning to help make sure that you guys are planning accordingly, right? Part of that, inspect and adapt. Take that inspection that we've done during retrospective and make sure that we're incorporating and adapting it during our sprint planning, right? So part of it is going through the stories again based on our velocity and capacity. Going through those stories one at a time, ensuring that they're ready to be committed, asking who needs to commit to the story, right? Or who wants to commit to the story, right? And then typically developers would know who would be committing to a specific story, right? And they will also have a specific allocation to each developer, assigning those stories to the developers, ensuring that those stories are pointed or have points in them. And then also by the end of the sprint planning, you want to once again validate with your development team to ensure that they are confident in what they've committed to, right? And also ensuring that you guys have not overcommitted during that sprint. And then sometimes you have a sprint goal, right? Some teams do, some teams do not. So depending on the team dynamic, when you do have your sprint goal, then you can officially start your sprints. And then after sprint planning, of course, you want to kind of give a summary of the team that, hey, we started our sprints. These are our commitments. Whatever kudos or whatever empowerment conversation you want to have with them, that is also welcome. So that's part of the roles and responsibility of a Scrum Master during sprint planning. Am I missing anything?
No, I just have a question. You said that sometimes some teams they don't have like a sprint goal for the sprint.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How does that work? When they don't have a sprint goal, I'm
You'd be
just.
surprised. Part of it is that you start the sprint. We've already have identified the stories that we plan to commit to, and then we just start the sprint.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's odd for me not to have a sprint goal, but okay.
It happens. It happens. All right. So during sprint review, you just once again want to make sure you have your invites ready, ensure that you have the right people in that meeting, and also ensure that you speak with the product owner and also your tech lead, right? To understand who will be demoing what events. And also, do we actually have something to demo? It's important to know that before you go into your demo. And if you don't have anything to demo, it's important to send an email or notification to everyone and saying that, hey, we actually do not have anything to demo today, right? So that way everyone is aware. And then of course during the demo, once again, setting the tone for that demo, and then of course handing it to whomever needs to actually do the demonstration. And then, of course, at the end of the demo or after the demo or review, you definitely want to go ahead, close the sprints if all of the feedback has been given and you guys have discussed what needs to go where, right? Closing your sprints, moving stories that need to go to the backlog or needs to go to the next sprint, right? Understanding those feedbacks and understanding that the product owner understand that feedback is incorporated in the backlog or in the sprint backlog, right? So those are some of the activities as a Scrum Master you'll be doing during sprint review. Am I missing something?
No, well done.
All righty. Last but not the least, retrospective meeting. So before retro, right, it's important as a Scrum Master to understand your team dynamic, right? Understand what does the team look like, what do they like, what they don't like. Are they quiet? Are they more engaging, right? Because then that would help you understand what you can bring in as an icebreaker or the type of retrospective meeting you need to have, right? Even understanding the prior sprint that you guys just had, right? Was it intense? Was it really complex? Were there multiple priorities, right? Were there multiple issues that came up? That will really help you understand the type of technique to use in your retrospective meeting, right? So it's good to do all of that research first. And then, of course, during your retrospective meeting, you want to now, whatever form of retrospective meeting, retrospective technique you want to use, you can go ahead and use it, right? You have the 3 L's, you have the what went well, what didn't go well, and any improvements, right? You have the sailboat technique. There's so many retrospective that you can use, right? You also have Mural that has multiple templates that you can use for retrospective meeting. And of course, I always encourage before you begin the retro, always have some kind of icebreaker or activity that you can do with the team, right? To really build the team rapport and then proceed. And then, of course, after retrospective meeting, you want to make sure that whatever action item that you guys have identified, that everyone or whomever is actually accountable for that action item and is also transparent in one way or the other to the team, so that way everyone is executing it. And also part of your job is to ensure that those action items are being followed throughout the life cycle of that sprint, right? So those are some of the roles and responsibility of a Scrum Master in retrospective meeting. And then of course there's some action items that you as a Scrum Master may own. So it's important also to role model what it would look like to follow through on action items. All righty. Now we're moving to development team. All
Yes.
right. It's like, yes, you're almost there. So when it comes to development team, right, it says dev team are structured and empowered by the organization to organize and manage their own work. It's important to understand that. So the dev team should definitely be self-organizing or self-managing, and they hopefully should be cross-functional, right? It's important to have a cross-functional team. The dev team should have necessary skill sets to be able to develop the increments, right, at the end of each sprint. It says that the Scrum recognizes no titles, in the sense that the development team, right, they're all there, the testers, the coders, whatever the case may be, they're working as a unit and not necessarily separate. So each individual development team member may have a specialized skills or area of focus, but it's also important that you as a Scrum Master give them the opportunity to really sync with each other, learn from each other, because that's how they build that cross-functional skill set, right? All right, so when it comes to different meetings, what does that look like for Scrum for development team, right? So pre-backlog refinement meeting. I know for me, as a Scrum Master, I typically like to have them review the backlog items before we go into refinement meeting, because then it prepares them and give them opportunity to ask better and more questions. And then during refinement meeting, they're there to understand those requirements, right? Identify any dependencies, any risk, complexity, or the volume of work, right? And then, of course, participate in estimation, right? They're there to give the estimation or the story points. And then, of course, after backlog refinement meeting, if there's any spike analysis or any additional work or tech stories that needs to be written, then they'll be the one to be able to support in creating those technical stories or any further guidance. They'll be the one to give those feedback, right? And then, of course, during daily stand-up, the Scrum, I keep saying the Scrum Master, the dev team should definitely once again be updating their status of their work, right? Before they get into the daily stand-up. So updating that, if they're going to be out for that day, they definitely need to let the Scrum Master or the whole team know that they're going to be out. If there's any remaining work that they cannot meet, they need to be able to understand that, because during the daily stand up is where they'll be having that conversation, right? As far as in the progress that they've done so far, if they're going to be taken off soon, if they're not able to meet their commitments, if there's any impediment, dependencies or blockers that they've come across, they need to be able to identify that, right? And also some of the solutions they're taking when it comes to resolving their impediments and blockers, they need to also discuss that. If they need support or they're having issues, they need to be able to call that out, right? And seek for support, right? Because that's really what the daily stand up is about. And then of course, after the daily stand up, whatever feedback, right, they'll take that on, or completing the rest of their work will be part of their responsibilities. All right. What about for sprint planning? So when it comes to sprint planning, right? Of course, before sprint planning, they need to be able to tell the Scrum Master about their availability, right? Their capacity. They need to be able to tell their Scrum Master. And then during this sprint planning, once again, they want to understand each of those stories, especially the stories that they're going to be working on, right? And if story points are given in the sprint planning and not the backlog refinement meeting, then understanding that requirement or the user story so that way they can estimate is very, very important. And oftentimes too, some team creates tasks for each user story in sprint planning, or some team just take that outside of sprint planning and work together in doing that. So that will be part of their responsibility during sprint planning. And then, of course, after sprint planning, they want to now start executing their work, right? Whether it's by creating tasks or by now doing the coding or by working with other teams to either resolve impediments, blockers, or understand the story more. So that way they can be able to be successful at the end of the sprint. So that will be part of their roles and responsibilities. All right. When it comes to sprint review, this is where I feel like it's time for them to shine, right? Demonstrate the work that they have done. Oftentimes, before sprint review, they should go through the story, update their story, ensure that the story is actually ready to be demoed. And if it's not, they need to communicate that, right? And then, of course, prepare for their demonstration, right? Because during the sprint review, that's when they will start demonstrating the actual work or functionality that they've built, right? And ensuring that those functionality actually meet the definition of done and meet the definition of those acceptance criteria listed, right? And then it's important too for them to also maintain some of those feedback, right? Because those feedback is also what's going to support them in for the next line of work, or at least guide them to what they need to now be mindful of or start doing, right? Or stop doing. And then, of course, last but not the least, retrospective meeting. So the developers, again, I think the retrospective meeting too is where it's time for them to shine, right? As a Scrum Master, I like to actually send the link out way before the retrospective meeting. So that way they can actually start adding their feedback way ahead of time, right? And oftentimes I encourage them, if you don't want your name to be identified, you can actually leave it anonymous, right? So having them create some of those improvement items or those what went well, what didn't go well prior to retrospective meeting, right? And then of course during retrospective meeting, this is where we now need to have a conversation about some of those inputs, right? What didn't go well, what went well, any improvement items, and oftentimes I like them to identify solutions, right? And out of those solutions, we're going to come up with action items, and oftentimes encourage them to actually be the one to own those action items, right? So that way they can be able to execute it um, in the following sprints, right? And then, of course, after retrospective meeting, they want to now take on or start executing those action items that has been identified, right? So essentially for the development team, retrospective meeting is for them to really open up, right? Open up about things that they don't like, whether it's processes, people's communication, collaborations, how work is being done or how work is being received. That is a place for them to feel safe enough to open and have those discussions. And I think that is pretty much it for some of the roles and responsibilities. Mr. Kirk, do you have any feedback?
Oh man, that was great. I was just, as you were going through the retrospective, I was going to ask you, how do you, deal with, maybe members of the development team who are a little bit nervous about saying anything, and then you pretty much covered it by saying that you sometimes give them the retrospective, like a form to fill out ahead of time. So this way they can just if they're a little bit nervous or uncomfortable, they could always fill out that form and just be anonymous, so that you can get their true feelings and feedback. So that's a good idea.
Yeah. Definitely, definitely. But it's important to kind of try to push them to talk a little bit, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Sometimes I will do like will of names. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever it lands to you, you have no choice but to talk.
But to talk, yeah.
Or do the round robin. So that way they know it's coming up. Even sometimes too, I would send the questions ahead of
Mm-hmm.
time. So
Yeah.
then they know, oh, this is the icebreaker or the questions that she's going to be using. So now I can prepare myself for that answer.
Yeah, great. So you have like a whole bunch of different techniques that you can use. So that's good.
Sure. All righty. Well, that is pretty much it for today's session. I hope it was informative, and I will see you guys on the next video. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. All right.